I was on my way to the book drop at the city library when something beautiful caught my eye, and my heart skipped a beat. She was wearing a red apron and a metal name tag. Miss Teresa. I guess you could say I stalked her, but we don't like to use that term in love stories. I admired her from a distance. It turned out that she worked in the children's section as a storyteller. She and her coworker would lay out a blanket, ring a bell, and little tykes would gather around for stories and puppet shows. I knew I was meant to be there when at the end of the show, Miss Teresa announced that the library was looking to hire another storyteller. As if the prospect of working beside that beautiful girl wasn't enough. I was a student, and I really needed the money. So I filled out the application and got an interview the next day. I told my prospective supervisor, Bertha, everything she wanted to hear, and how much I love books and children, and how I'm very good at choosing age-appropriate material. And, well, they must have been desperate, because soon I was donning my own red apron with my own metal name tag. I was now Mr. Steve, making a whopping $10 per hour. The best part was cramming into the tiny puppet stage next to Miss Teresa, playing out fantasies with furry creatures on our hands. For those magical moments, time seemed to slow down, and never mind the plethora of fussy children, there was only us. And Bob. Mr. Bob was the other storyteller, and he also had a thing for Miss Teresa. Mr. Bob was tall and strong. I did not like Mr. Bob, and Mr. Bob did not like me. When we played pat-a-cake, he went out of his way to make sure that he was the one clapping Miss Teresa's hands, and he would rather break the ring around the rosy than hold my hand. Furthermore, he constantly violated the rules, talking too loud and bringing food and drink into the library. To cover up his crimes, he would even stuff junk food into the puppets and threaten us if we told on him. Notwithstanding, when Mr. Bob was off stuffing his face, I jumped on the opportunity to ask Miss Teresa out on a date. And then another one. Technically, city employees weren't supposed to date each other, but we kept it on the down low. Though I'm pretty sure Mr. Bob found out. You see, once the three of us were performing a puppet show of Little Red Riding Hood. Following the library-approved script, the wolf, Mr. Bob, had just locked Little Red, Miss Teresa, in the closet when the hunter, yours truly, came in to save the day. Only Mr. Bob surprised us with an alternate ending. The wolf bit the hunter's jugular vein and pronounced him dead. The wolf then informed the audience that he and Little Red were married and lived happily ever after. Afterward, I complained to Bertha about this scandalous adulteration of a children's classic, but she just informed me that Mr. Bob was the senior storyteller and therefore was allowed more creative liberties than others, namely me. The next day, Mr. Bob had another surprise. When it was time to pull the magic bunny puppet out of the hat, instead of introducing the letter of the day, the bunny was holding a bouquet of flowers for Miss Teresa. This was getting serious, and I knew I had to act fast. So, not too many story times later, I had a surprise of my own. Planted within the paws of the magic bunny, hidden within the magic hat, was a little green box, and within the little green box was a 24-karat gold, coated, engagement ring. I was on a student budget, though the ring did have a 100% genuine cubic zirconium. The only thing remaining before the scheduled appearance of the magic bunny was the puppet show. I was Pinocchio, Miss Teresa was the fairy, and Mr. Bob was the whale. All was going well. It looked as if Pinocchio was going to escape from the whale and achieve his dream of becoming a real boy. Until, to everyone's horror, the whale vindictively bit off Pinocchio's head. For me, that was the last straw. "Why, Mr. Bob?" I cried, and in the act of throwing up my arms, I accidentally knocked over the puppet stage, which upon hitting the floor snapped in half. Of course, Bertha happened to be watching in the background, her arms folded. In the corner of my eye, I could see Mr. Bob's devilish grin. He must have known I was planning something big, and I'd fallen for his bait. Whether or not I was about to be fired, the show had to go on. "Don't worry, children," I said. "The fairy cured Pinocchio's head problem, and everyone lived happily ever after. And now it's time for a visit from the magic bunny." Before Mr. Bob could intervene, I pulled out the top hat, stuffed my hand into the puppet, and with the help of the children, spoke the well-known incantation, "Magic Bunny, please come out." And he did. With the little green box in his paws, I fell to one knee. "Miss Teresa," I said, "will you—" But as I stuttered, Mr. Bob took full advantage of the opportunity. He fell to one knee, took Miss Teresa by the hand, and said, "Will you marry me?" "Oh," said a shocked Miss Teresa. Then she turned back to me. "But what did you want to ask me, Mr. Steve?" Will you..." That was when Mr. Bob, staring at me, picked up Pinocchio's severed head and crushed it with his free hand. I continued, "Will you marry Bob?" Miss Teresa looked between the two of us. Perhaps she thought Mr. Bob was her only chance. Perhaps Bob had also threatened to crush her skull. But whatever the reason, she said yes, and my life was over. Mr. Bob then proceeded to put my engagement ring on Miss Teresa's finger, and the audience cheered. Meanwhile, I walked to the employees' workroom and threw off my apron. Before Bertha could fire me, I quit. Then, doing the only logical thing for a heartbroken and monetarily broken student, I went down to the parking garage and collapsed in a dumpster. There, among the newspapers, hamburger wrappers, and stinky diapers, I was ready to give up. Until I heard a voice. "Hey," someone said. Rising out of the trash, covered in banana peels and melted ice cream, was the dirtiest man I'd ever seen. It was Harry, the town bum. "How'd you end up down here?" he asked. I replied, "I lost the girl I love to the man I hate." Harry nodded knowingly. "Me too." "Really?" "I loved a librarian named Beatrice, but she left me for George the janitor, whom she left for Mr. Darcy. Now she's an old maid, and I'm a bum. I should have known you can't marry a librarian, but once you give your heart to the library, it will never leave. That's why I'm here." "Well," I said, "at least we have each other." "I don't think so, kid. This is my dumpster. Go win your girl back." "I tried, but he's a big bad wolf." "Then learn from Little Red. When the wolf eats you up, cut yourself back out." "That's not how the story goes. The wolf locked Little Red in the closet." "Son, you've obviously been the victim of watered-down storytelling. The true Grimm's fairy tale involves scissors and plenty of blood." I couldn't believe it. The children's department had been using me to spread propaganda. Thinking of Mr. Bob further adulterating the classics with completely unnecessary violence, as opposed to the proper culturally celebrated violence, my blood began to boil. Thank you, Harry. It's time for the library to see just how grim I can be. At the next story time, Miss Teresa and Mr. Bob were behind the puppet stage. Papa Bear, Mr. Bob, was in the process of devouring Goldilocks when I stepped in. "That's not how the story goes," I said. "Oh, Mr. Steve," said Papa Bear, "you're not supposed to be here." Then, in a more hushed voice, "Someone call security." "I wouldn't do that if I were you," I said, drawing closer to the puppet stage. "Did you ever hear about the 5 little ducks that went out to play? When the mama duck said quack, 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 not one of them came back." "Yes, I know the rhyme." Papa Bear was growing impatient. "I'm not finished. When the daddy duck said quack, 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 the game was over. You can't hide what you've been doing forever, Mr. Bob." At that, Mr. Bob was so angry that he threw Papa Bear right at me. For a moment, I panicked when I saw those terrible teeth and claws. But inspired by my love for Miss Teresa, I pulled out my knife and flung it. Time slowed down as every child took in the gruesome sight. And then, just before Papa Bear devoured me, the knife tore open his belly, exposing torrents of fluff, M&Ms, and a can of soda. A gasp fell over the audience. "Yes," I said, "Mr. Bob has been hiding food and drink in the library." And at that, a horrified Mr. Bob came out from behind the puppet stage. He threw off his apron and ran right out of the library, never to return. As the scandalized crowd went their way, Bertha approached me. "That was not age-appropriate, Mr. Steve." "Yes," I admitted, "but very true to the original folktales, and that makes it all right." "It looks like we'll be needing a new storyteller." I happen to be a storyteller. "And as the new senior, I'm afraid you'll have to grant me creative liberties." I then approached Miss Teresa. "So, that ring you're wearing is actually mine. Will you marry me instead of Bob?" "Okay," said Teresa, because I didn't have enough time in this story to develop her personality. And that is how I met my wife, and how I became a storyteller. And the moral is, no matter what Harry the Bum said, librarians are hot. You should totally marry one. Thank you.